HTTP handlers and HTTP modules, actually these have been there from the days of dynamic web page building. Now what exactly is the role of these HTTP handlers and modules? So whenever some request comes, we want to do some kind of filtration, or we would say we want to do some kind of customization on a web server. So all this customization of a web server request lifecycle could be achieved using HTTP handlers and HTTP modules. So right from those days of SAP application development, when people used to use VC++ for development of dynamic web pages, the most complicated stuff. I'm talking about something like 1997-98. We used to write SAP applications for customizing IIS. And then on top of it, we got ASP layer. But ASP was what? Some ready-made HTTP handler which was processing the complete .asp file. So what Microsoft did over a period of time, they gave a lot of built-in handlers and built-in modules which could ease the job of developer. So when the request comes from browser to server, we have handlers registered performing certain action, and handlers perform the action based on the extensions, based on the path. So these paths have to be registered with IIS web server. Now what we used to achieve using handlers and modules in the past, now we can achieve the same thing using middlewares, ASP.NET Core middlewares. So before we get into how it is done, just understand the basic syntax of how a module was written. There is supposed to be a class which is inherited from, or which has implemented iHTTP module. I'm not going to write this code, I'm just using it for explanation of how a module has been replaced now with a middleware. Now to give you a good example of module, there is a HTTP session module which is responsible for managing your session. There is a caching module which is responsible for handling your cache, HTTP cache, so that the request doesn't get processed at all. Even before the request starts executing, the page starts executing, it will check, the HTTP cache module is going to check if the output is already available for that page in the cache, and if it is there, it will directly render it to the browser. Session initialization was done in session module, and so on. So like that, there are so many modules which were built in before. But now what we achieved using custom modules, we can achieve using custom middlewares. So module was supposed to be a class which implements iHTTP module, and iHTTP module has methods application underscore begin request, application underscore end request. These two methods are coming from iHTTP application module, and rather init also, all the three. These three members are part of iHTTP module. So when we have these methods implemented here, in this init, not begin request and end request, only init is a part of this iHTTP module. So when we implement init, in the application object we registered certain events. We have got begin request, end request, and begin session, end session, like that. Those methods which are in global.asax, if you have done traditional ASP.NET, those things are all events of HTTP application. So for each and every event we can add a handler, and these handlers will execute during the request life cycle. For example, begin request is going to execute for every request, and begin request I am going to get the context, and once we get the context, we know what we can do with it. So from source, which is an HTTP application, we get the context, and from context we can get request, response, session, all those objects we were able to get in traditional ASP. So we may probably produce the output here itself, and we would say context.response.end. We don't let the request proceed further. From here only the response will go to the browser. The ASPX page lifecycle doesn't even begin. Likewise, when the response is rendered and if you want to change something that was done in end request, just before the response is rendered to the browser, end request would execute. There also we get the context. So don't you think very similar to what middleware is? Begin request, end request comes in the life cycle of a request. Same thing now we can achieve with middleware. In middleware, we just write our code here. We have an invoke method, and here we can write something which we want to execute before the request gets processed. And if the request, and after that you can do next invoke. Now when you say next invoke, automatically it will go to the next in the pipeline and that code will execute. So you override invoke. To be precise, call it as, because it is async, call it as invoke async. And in invoke async, just execute next.invoke. We have learned this custom middleware. And here you are supposed to put request delegate next. And how do we register this middleware? With the help of use middleware. So same, we know how to write a custom middleware. We are now writing a custom middleware and we are writing code here which is going to execute just before the request begins processing. So we don't use modules anymore in ASP.NET Core. We instead use middleware, and so is the case even with HTTP handler. So here the interface name is iHTTP module, whereas here the interface name is iHTTP handler, and iHTTP handler has process request. And process request is responsible for processing your request and producing the output. Process request and generate response, both are actually members of iHTTP handler. Yes. So process, now what is the difference between module and handler? Remember, handlers are generally registered with the server for a given extension. Like to process .aspx file, there is a page handler. To process ASMX file, there is a web service handler. So different handlers were responsible for processing different files with appropriate extension. So process request would execute. We can perform some actions here, whatever we want. And generate response is the one where we actually produce the output, which we want to render it to the browser. Same thing we will do even with middleware. The only difference between the module middleware and the handler middleware is module middleware generally would let you to continue the middleware lifecycle. That means it would let you to go to next middleware. Handler is like short circuiting. You will not have next. You will not have next here. It will not let you to just execute the next, because handler by itself is supposed to perform the complete action. So when next is not there, it basically implies that it is a handler, and when next is there, it is like a module. That's the only difference. That's it. So the syntax for writing middleware is one and same whether it is module or handler. In case of module, you will have this line. After you do some kind of processing, you will have this line, and of course after this line you can have some kind of code here also. You can do some kind of cleanup. But difference between module and handler is what? Module is going to just work like a filter. Imagine you have put a filter in between in a request. So request will go through that filter, something will change in it, but it will pass through, and the page handler would still execute the final code. But handler is not like that. Handler is responsible for completely executing the code by itself. So if you want to simulate a handler, do not execute invoke next.invoke. If you want to simulate a module, execute next.invoke. But in either case, handlers or modules, we don't write them anymore by implementing the interfaces, but we simply write a custom middleware, and that serves the purpose. So that's all about the different middlewares functionalities, and we again, as I told you before, we continue to use lot of middlewares going forward. And you see here, if there is an extension, something ends with dot report, we do map path. If the path is dot report, we say that use this handler. That's it. So very useful and very important concept, middleware. It comes to the end. Thank you.